Hello and welcome to this session in which we will discuss testing of internal control. Well, when do we test internal control as auditors? Well, before we test, we have to perform certain steps. The first step before we test internal control is to learn, understand the internal control. And in the prior session, we looked at the three methods to understand internal control, which are narratives, flowchart, and internal control questionnaires. After we learn about the internal control, after we understand internal control, we will assess internal control. And we complete this step also on the prior sessions, where we assess internal control as either low, medium, or high. At this point, after we learn and assess internal control, we determine whether we are going to rely on internal control or not. We will only test internal control if we are going to rely on internal control. In other words, internal control is good. Good in a sense that it's a low control risk. Or it could be low or medium. So we are going to rely. If we are going to rely, we're going to go ahead and spend time to test the internal control. So if we are not going to rely, then we don't test. Why not? Because if that's the case, we're going to go directly into substantive testing and say their internal control are no good. We have to do more work to verify, to confirm, to collect evidence. This is what we do in substantive testing. So what is the purpose of the testing of the internal control? Is to evaluate control effectiveness for a lower audit risk. We want to know how well is their internal control, and if they are good enough, we can rely on them, then we will have a lower audit risk. It means less substantive testing. Well, what we do is when we test, we want to ensure that control are active, they are working, they are consistently applied, because if they are working and not consistently applied, how good they are? They're not good, and correctly executed by individuals. They are designed properly, we assess them, we test them, they are working properly, working constantly, and the individuals are following the instruction. Now bear in mind, in the real world, step 1, 2, and 3 might be accomplished simultaneously, all at the same time. So we learn about the internal control, we assess, and we test all at the same time. But in education, we have to teach you those in 3 different steps because there are 3 separate steps. But an experienced internal auditor, and doesn't have to be internal auditor, an experienced auditor can perform all 3 steps at the same time. So let's go ahead and get started to discuss what are the procedures to test internal control. Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, FarhatLectures.com. Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today. There are 4 procedures to test internal control by auditors. The first one is inquiries. The second procedure is examination of documents. Observation is third, and reperform is fourth. Now, if you know anything about Farhat Lectures, once I have a list of things, I'm going to go over each item separately, starting with inquiries to test control. What is inquiries? Simply put, inquiring, talking to the staff, asking questions, especially relevant client staff, people who are working with the control. Now, bear in mind, inquiries is not highly reliable, but it's a way to learn about the internal control and in a way of tested, but bear in mind, not highly reliable evidence, although they are valid, because what they tell us, we might be able to learn more or determine if there's any conflicting information. Bear in mind, people might change their mind, change their statement, or even lie to you, or they may not understand what you are asking them, but it's a valid way to test the control. For example, to verify unauthorized access restriction to computer files, we might talk to people that are overseeing the computer library and online password security and ask them about access privileges. We're just gonna ask them. We're gonna test the system, but we're also gonna talk to them. Another way to test internal control is examination of document. People will tell you a lot of things. That's fine. We're doing this. We're not doing that, so on and so forth. But the internal control generate a lot of paperwork. So you're going to review documents, records, and report, because most control produce distinct evidence, whether that evidence is paper or electronic, for controlling testing. So what you do, when a customer order is placed, it leads to a credit-approved sale order with the original order attached for further processing. Well, what will you do as an auditor? Go ahead. Verify this control by checking that documents are complete, correctly paired, and have the necessary signature. Well, if that's what they're doing, look at the document, see if that document shows that. That's another way to test control. A third way to test control is observation. Basically, what's observation? Just looking to see what people are doing. Now, you got to keep in mind, when people know they are being watched, they might act differently. So it's better if you do this observation without people notifying the people. Because some control don't produce any paperwork, don't produce any tangible evidence. Okay? Making retrospective verification impossible. So you cannot really know what happened. You have to be there at that moment to monitor. For example, segregation of duties depend on the individual executing specific task without document proof. For such control, the only way to determine whether there is segregation of duties or not is to observe the application throughout the year. A good example will be if two individuals are opening the mail, if two people are opening the mail. We don't know if two people are opening the mail or not, unless we can review the security camera. If there's a security camera monitoring that area, we can go ahead and review it, making sure two individuals are opening the mail and endorsing the checks as for deposit only. Otherwise, the auditor will have to just go in there and sit and observe. And basically, I work at a company right after college, a company called City Financial, where I opened the mail when we received the check with another individual as part of the internal control. We were two individuals. We were not always the same two individuals, but two individuals always opened the mail. There is no record of that. The only way to observe this, again, to observe it, or if there's video cameras nowadays, you would review that. Reperform client process. Go through the system and input the entries as if the client themselves are processing the transaction. Some control action, despite having related document, lack comprehensive content for assessing control effectiveness. So the only way you are going to know whether controls are working properly in this setting is to go through the whole process. For example, if sales invoice prices are sourced from the master file price list without explicit control documentation, what would you do? Go ahead. An auditor might reenact the control to validate its accuracy. Well, the auditor here might cross-check sales prices against the authorized price list to the transaction date. If it's consistent, then the control is working properly. What we did is we reprocessed the transaction, making sure it's working as expected. The next thing we are going to discuss is the extent of testing. How much testing we are going to perform? Well, it all depends on the initial assessed control risk, whether it's low, medium, or high. If you want to place a greater reliance on the control, okay, then you have to do more work, more thorough and trustworthy evidence, then you have to do more work. For the desired lower control risk, auditor will apply a broader and more in-depth control test. If you want to really make sure it's working properly, test it as much as possible. But the extent of the test depends on many factors, such as prior year audit evidence. High risks from previous year must be tested. If from the prior year we identified an area that's high risk, we're going to test that area more. Increased risk, generally speaking, necessitate stronger evidence. The higher the risk, the more work we have to do. Okay, then what we have to do is update and assess prior year's functioning. If the area is better now, the risk is gone, they fixed it, then we have to update our assessment. Also, control risk for significant risks. If the risk is significant, well, the more risky the account is, the bigger the amount, the materiality, the impact of it, then the more work we have to do. Also, we can do partial period testing. For control active throughout the year, we can test periodically, like quarterly, then supplement at the end of the year. For example, if we're testing IT should work constantly. So if we tested IT during the second or the third quarter, their IT system, assuming they have good controls for program change, it should be working by the end of the year, assuming they did not make any changes. So partial period testing means what? Means you can test throughout the year. Other accounts you have to test at the end of the year. Controls are affected only when they are applied consistently. So sometimes we have to do it at the beginning, in the middle, and at the end. And also we have to test operating effectiveness once every 3 years. Now there is a relationship between test of control and procedures to obtain understanding. Remember, when we obtain understanding, if you remember, we did inquiries, inspection, observation, reperformance. And when I talked about test of control, we also told you we have to perform inquiries, inspection, observation, and reperformance. Now, yes, there's an overlap, but there's a difference in the extent and how much work we are going to do when we are learning about internal control versus test of control. Therefore, what we want to do is to explain the difference. Inquiries. Do we use inquiries to understand internal control? Yes. And we use a lot of inquiries. When we are doing the understanding of internal control, we are going to ask a lot of questions. So there's a lot of inquiries in obtaining understanding of the internal control. How about when we test control? Yes, we will use, but not as much as when we are learning about the system. When we test control, remember, inquiries is part of that. But remember, it doesn't yield high reliable evidence. We ask, but we don't rely on it that much. Inspection. Do we do inspection while understanding internal control? Yes, we might inspect one transaction just to understand how the system works, because all what we're doing is understanding. When we are testing control and we are doing inspection, we might sample many. So notice there's more work in testing of control when it comes to inspection. Observation. Do we observe when we are learning about the system? Yes, we will observe, but not much. Just we want to observe to learn how the system is working. When we test control, we are going to observe multiple times because we want to make sure the system, it's not only working, it's working constantly, multiple times. Reperformance. Do we do reperformance and understanding the internal control? No need. Just no need, because we're not looking to see whether it's working properly or not. We're not testing it, so we don't do performance. When we test control, yes, we either use software or we sample, but we go through the steps. We reperform certain transaction. So why do we assess control risk? Why do we test control risk? Why do we do all of this? To end up with substantive testing, to determine. The purpose of testing of control is to evaluate control effectiveness for lower audit risk. So the auditor utilizes the control risk evaluation along with the outcome from control test to establish the detection risk and the substantive testing for the audit. So we do all this work, learn about the control, assess the control, test the control, to eventually determine, assuming we're going to rely on the control, how much work to do in terms of substantive testing. And we'll talk about more about substantive testing later on. But we want to make sure we understand the whole purpose of testing is to rely. If we rely, we do less substantive testing. If we're going to rely less, we're going to do more substantive testing. That's the idea. Let's take a look at a multiple choice from Farhat lectures. All the following are procedures usually performed by auditors to support the operating effectiveness of internal control. Simply put, we have series 4 answers. One of them is not for the testing of the operating effectiveness. To support the operating effectiveness means to test the control. Starting with examining documents to make sure that required signature or initials are present. Is this performed to make sure the internal control is working properly? And the answer is yes. This is part of to support to test the internal control. So the answer is incorrect for D, because it is something that we do, because the question is except. All of them are except. Let's take a look at A. A is observing the entity's employee performing controls at various points during the year. Do we have that? Well, the answer is yes. Do we perform this observation? Yes. If we perform this step, we do perform it. Therefore, A is out, because that's also one of the procedures to test the internal control. What's left is B and C. Reperforming the control activities, or selecting one document of transaction type and tracing it from initiation through the entire accounting process. They look similar, but you have to be very careful. Reperforming the control activities, it means going through the whole process from A to Z, reperforming the entire control activities. Now, when it comes to C, C is a walkthrough. Select one document type and tracing it from initiation. You're not performing anything. Tracing it, just like looking through the system, making sure everything is matching. This is a walkthrough. C is a walkthrough. And walkthrough, when do we do a walkthrough? We perform a walkthrough when we are learning about the internal control, not testing. We perform control activities when we are testing to support the effectiveness of the internal control. Therefore, C is the answer, because C is a walkthrough, and walkthrough happens not to test the operating effectiveness, not to support the operating effectiveness. It's when you are obtaining an understanding. So you have to be very careful. Auditing questions are very tricky, and that's why Farhat lectures will provide you more questions to make sure those subtle differences are clarified. What should you do now? Go to Farhat lectures, look at additional MCQs, true, false, additional resources, whether you are a CPA exam candidate or an accounting student. Good luck, study hard, and stay safe.